Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Starmer's Psychodrama and Hamlet's Grievance with Process. Marcellus. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 4. Well, hi everybody, and today, as you can see from the title, I want to link together the political shenanigans in the UK at the moment, the notion of process, because that's a word that keeps cropping up in the scandal, but just use the political scandal not as an hour and a 20-minute talk about politics, because I think it's beyond politics. People across the political spectrum are just fed up. It's not about that. It's about the way in which the word process keeps getting relied upon. And I'm using this as a metaphor or an embodiment, an encapsulation of the idea that in our society today, substance tends to get replaced by process all the time. So on this channel, I always give the example of bureaucracy and how, you know, the computer says no is one of the skits on UK TV back a time. The idea that the process determines everything, and deprofessionalization's happened a lot. You know, what used to be doctors, teachers, all these respected professions now have to follow all these endless protocols. And in politics, people hide behind the processes as happening at the moment. So I'm taking that notion of process from the current political shenanigans and then exploring the notion of process in how it's replicated in other parts of not only modern society, but the way we think. So in neuroscience and philosophy of the mind, process in various explanations is interpreted in different ways. So I'm going to look at some neuroscience that follows process as the be-all and end-all and actually thinks you can measure subjectivity to some extent in third-person objective data terms. So I'll quickly look at that. And then there's a philosopher of the mind, Thomas Metzinger, who argues that there actually is no self, and what we think of as ourselves is a concatenation, a conglomeration, whatever long word you want to use, of phenomenal impressions that we have. And they're organized in this self-model, he calls it. And he develops from that this idea there is no thing as a subjective self as we've conventionally understood it. And against that, I'm going to look at it. So he reduces everything to processes within the brain. And I'm going to counter that with very quickly introduce some critiques, some criticisms of that notion. And then all the way through, what hopefully woven throughout, you might be asking yourself, what's Hamlet got to do with all of this? Hamlet, as I'll explain as we go along, I think is really significant, if for no other reason. It's such a deep play. It has significance if you think of the UK politics as the Danish court. There's lots of politicking going on. So Hamlet's a political play. It's a play about subjectivity. And also it's a play, as I'll mention, about hypocrisy. But behind all of this, there's also the notion of the play within a play. So in Hamlet, it's called The Mousetrap, the murder of Gonzago. And within that play, within the play, there's also a dumb show before the play proper begins. So there's a mimed play before the play within the play. And Hamlet as a dramatic piece of theatre is also a play that we witness as part of our life, which can be interpreted in theatrical terms. So there's this recursive levels, these layers. And I find it quite ironic that in some of the most advanced philosophy of mind discussions, as I'm going to show you, it segues into neuroscience, and one of the theories I'm presenting is how they think there are various recursive levels of these models within models. And I'm pointing out in, I think the first version of Hamlet was 1601 to 3, roundabout, say, so let's call it 1602, so 1602-ish. That far, away Shakespeare had such a sophisticated understanding, arguably, of how the human brain works, because I'm going to argue that that's what Hamlet basically encapsulates. These various processes of how we conceptualize and think things through. At a neuroscientific model, this is how they approach it, and yet I'd argue it's replicated in Shakespeare's approach to, in particularly with Hamlet, the play within a play within a play motif. And I just think it's his way of approaching subjectivity is something of an answer to these dry neuroscientific accounts of what it is to be a person. And as I always say on this channel, it's what the channel's devoted to try and compensate at least slightly for the loss of the art that I think we should be exposed to. But just as neuroscience is interested in all these ideas of ego formation and the conceptualization techniques of the neurology of the brain, the very cultural artifact we have that embodies all these features is becoming less and less accessible to people because our society is less and less literate. So anyway, I found this, just to get stuck into it now, I found this photograph of Keir Starmer. This was referred to as the Rose Garden speech. It was very early on in his premiership, and there was a bit of a scandal. He was taking presents from a Lord Alley, a close associate. Let's just leave it at that. And he did a talk, and it came to be known it's in the gardens of Downing Street. So it was the Rose Garden speech. And given what's going on at the moment, at the time of presenting this video, he's still nominally in charge, but we'll see. This video could date very, very quickly. But I just love the fixing the foundations, the lovely rhetoric they use in politics. And for those that have a country and western mindset, I just thought this was vaguely funny. This should be his walk-on song if he ever does any more conferences or anything. I beg your pardon. I never promised you a rose garden, he says, whilst making excuses in the rose garden. So I mentioned this idea of the play within life's play. That's what I think the significance of Shakespeare is to all of this. And in those terms, in the title, the word psychodrama. So this is the definition of a psychodrama, an action-based psychotherapy developed by Jacob L. Moreno, where clients use guided, spontaneous role-playing to reenact real life, past situations, dreams, or inner emotional struggles. It acts as a drama of the mind to foster catharsis, gain insights, and practice new behaviours. Now, my claim is that with literature like Shakespeare, within a cultural context, if there was more of it, it would be able to play more of this role. What we're witnessing in the politics of Keir Starmer is a psychodrama at a very low level, because conceptually it's so shallow that this referral to all process was followed, as I'll give you examples of in a second. It's about process. It's not about the stupid decision in the first place that led to the whole debacle, which was the appointment of Peter Mandelson to be ambassador of the US, and he was a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein. So that was the atrocious failure of judgment from the Prime Minister, and that's been elided or obscured by this constant referral back and this constant discussion of were proper processes followed. And the point I'm going to keep re-emphasizing throughout the talk is there's a difference between substance and process, and we live in a society where process is the thing that tends to get emphasized all the time. And this notion of psychodrama, on the one hand, it can be used colloquially to describe what's going on when there's a big scandal, but it doesn't describe, there isn't any real catharsis, because the discussion of the scandal goes round and round in circles about process. When I'm making the point that what literature does really well, and what the particular play Hamlet does exceptionally well, it's arguably Shakespeare's most profound play. there's a lot to choose from, but that would be my nomination for his most profound and deep play. One of the roles it plays, it explores a really complex character who represents such competing pressures and aspects of what subjectivity is all about. And it's through the performance of the play, if you experience the play and you empathize with it fully, you get exposed to a very complex notion of subjectivity as a form of a psychodrama. And I think that's why I might refer a few times during this talk to how the Hamlet, the play, haunts us in our culture still today. Just like at the beginning of the play, the ghost of his father, Hamlet's father, comes to speak to him. So the play starts with a haunting, but the play, I'm suggesting, if you step back a bit, the play itself haunts us like Hamlet was haunted by his father, because it fulfills this psychodramatic role. So this is this Rose Garden speech. I'm absolutely determined, or aspects of it, little excerpts. I'm absolutely determined to restore honesty and integrity to government, because I think that is core to ensuring that people appreciate that politics can be a force for good. Yeah, this did not age well. I think one of the reasons people have been disillusioned, disaffected if you like, in recent years is because they can't see politics as a force for good. So that process and procedure, doing things properly, matters to me beyond the fact that it, as it were, should be done properly. So to see the emphasis on process and procedure and doing things properly, this was at the very beginning of his premiership. And then this is what happened. I just love this photograph, because what a cheeky chappy old Peter Mandelson is. So obviously Keir Starmer's got his typically robotic wooden fixed rictus, but Peter Mandelson, larger than life. What could possibly go wrong making him ambassador whilst following all due process and procedure? So as I said, I want to weave in some themes from Hamlet all the way through. So Hamlet in this Act 2, Scene 2. O God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Guildenstern, which dreams Guildenstern, which dreams indeed are ambition, for the very substance of the ambitious is merely the shadow of a dream. Hamlet responds, a dream itself is but a shadow. Rosencrantz, truly, and I hold ambition of so airy and light a quality that it is but a shadow's shadow. And I've emboldened that phrase there. But just to quickly go through this, at the third line at the top, I have bad dreams. There is one theory that because there were quartos and then folios and quartos, these different editions of the plays, various printing errors crept in. And one argument is that should say, I have had bad dreams. Sorry, I have had dreams, rather than I have bad dreams. And I quite like, I don't mean to tell old Bill how to write, but it would be interesting if it was originally I have had dreams. I think it adds some ambiguity, rather than specifying that they're bad dreams. But anyway, the rest of it, I made this point earlier about the concept of the recursive nature in models of neuroscience and how the brain works. Thomas Metzinger's theory that we'll encounter shortly has this notion of recursivity. And he also, I'm going to quote you sections where he talks about shadows on the wall, Plato's wall of the cave. And you can see this alluded to, the way in which ambition, the motivation for the actions, can be seen as the shadow of a dream. A dream is already an insubstantial thing. So the shadow of a dream is a further recursive move away. And Hamlet himself then says, a dream itself is but a shadow. And then Rosencrantz makes the point about ambition, of so airy and light a quality, it's a shadow's shadow. So this is all relevant to the notion of recursive levels within a self-model. In other words, a model of subjectivity that Thomas Metzinger talks about. That's one key element that's going to be relevant to the rest of this talk. The shadow element, the ambition itself, so the whole scandal that Keir Starmer's found himself caught in, is obviously, it's the political world, it's all the shallow ambition of all these people vying against each other. And then the final point I'd make is, if you could keep in mind, I'll return to it later on, but the very first phrase, oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell. I don't mean to become too fixated, but I'm going to talk about walnuts and their similarity to brains, because I'm slightly fixated on that. But I love this contrast, bounded in a nutshell, and count myself a king of infinite space. So there's this tension between the enclosed nature of a nutshell or the brain. And remember, he looks at the skull of Yorick in the gravedigger scene. But within, and this is one of the things that neuroscience tries to explain, within the brain, that's this self-enclosed jelly-like mass that's relatively small, there is this infinite ability to think and communicate, and for someone like Shakespeare to write such amazing plays. And that's what's known as the hard problem of consciousness in the philosophy of mind, how to explain this gelatinous grey mass that's between most of our ears and the ability to imagine whole universes. That is the ultimate tension that surrounds the concept of subjectivity. And I think it's beautifully expressed in Hamlet, which the greater play, the rest of Hamlet, it's a sustained exploration of this issue, the notion of subjectivity and what is contained within our skull. And at the end, when he's looking at Yorick's skull in the gravedigger scene, that's what we're reduced to, that quintessence of dust. So this was Ollie Robbins. For the non-British people, he was the former permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And he was interviewed, so he had to give evidence to the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee on the 21st of April, so very recently. And I quite like this photograph. What, me? How could you question my integrity? But he was one of the chief, if not the chief civil servant, who was sacrificed on the altar of the Prime Minister's need to avoid the scandal. And with relevance to the title of the talk, what he said as part of his evidence was, I could recite the code to you. He's talking about the Civil Service Code, and I believe it, along with probably the Book of Common Prayer, which is the Book of the Church of England, is one of the two things I can hold in my memory. So why I wanted to show you this was the idea that you may think that I'm obsessed or over-fixated on the concept of process. It really is one of my abiding disgruntlements with modern society, that this bureaucratic, technocratic mindset. But I just found this a fascinating piece of evidence. So this is a highly educated, very intelligent civil servant, and the two things he holds almost on equal level is the Civil Service Code and a piece of church prayer book. This is how much the notion of process can actually be valued by some people. This similarly, I think this was 2 days later, this is a woman called Kat Little. She's the Cabinet Office Permanent Secretary and Civil Service Chief Operating Officer, giving evidence, and that was 2 days later on the 23rd of April. And she said, my view is that due process was followed. So this is the point I was making at the beginning. It's not that, shall we all focus on the fact that an atrocious lapse of judgment occurred, whereby a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein was appointed to the most important diplomatic post there is for the UK, the ambassador to the US. Let's just talk about whether process was followed. So the way I like to think of why process is important and why our society's overemphasis upon it leads to my overfixation on it. It's this crucial distinction between how you do something and why are you doing it. So there are huge swathes of modern society. I'm thinking, for example, in the UK, our National Health Service is like an endless pit, it seems, of needing money. And it's not the fault of medical staff or nurses who are wasting huge amounts of money. There's a never-ending expansion of the bureaucratic layers of the organisation. So no one is seemingly able to structure our National Health Service by focusing on the why are we doing this, to treat people. So why are we spending all this money on middle management? Rather, these almost semi-autonomous independent processes are set up by managers and bureaucrats and technocrats who set up systems that require yet more systems, and they are the only people who can judge if they're necessary or not, and on it goes. So this notion of substance versus mechanisms and procedures, and the Mandelson vetting process that I've been using as an example, is just one illustration of forgetting to fixate on the substance or to focus on the substance, and rather to fixate on the mechanisms and procedures. And what I hope is different in this talk, so it's not the standard who said what to whom in the Keir Starmer Mandelson controversy. Rather, I want to show how the Mandelson Starmer controversy and his links to Epstein and all of that, it's a symptom of an underlying disease. And I think it's a mistake to see it as the most significant feature when it's an what would you call it? Epiphenomenon. It's something on the surface. It's not the actual underlying core thing that we should be paying attention to. So in philosophy and neuroscience, I see the same type of and I keep using the word fixation. I think I need to find another word. Over-focus, excessive focus upon models versus the notion of human beings in their full context becoming individual subjects. So because science and philosophy, some philosophers take subjectivity seriously in its own terms. But the example I'm going to use of Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher of the mind who, he isn't crass in the way he uses science, but he has, in my view, taken on an excessively scientific approach to an area, i.e. subjectivity, that doesn't lend itself or shouldn't lend itself to objective, inverted commas, scientific methods of trying to detect what's behind subjectivity. What I'll be giving you examples of is arguably the inappropriateness of trying to understand subjectivity using third person data orientated evidence, when subjectivity by its very nature is a felt phenomenal interior activity. So how can you apply external scientific methods will be one of the questions to be asked. And then that's in philosophical and scientific terms, how this over concentration upon methods or mechanisms or procedures versus the substance of why are we doing this. I think one of the reasons it's become such a dominant social value is the technological infrastructure all around us. Social media being the most alarming example, where the very name illustrates the oxymoronic culture we're living in, perhaps emphasizing the moronic side of that statement or phrase. But social media is the adjective social is the opposite. Media, by its very definition, mediates, it gets in the way of. And yet, media are claiming a social aspect that they were designed to replace and simulate in some ways. But by their very nature, engaging in media activity is not the same as face-to-face social engagement. It can't be. But the way in which, I'm just fascinated by the way in which technological culture takes the name of the very thing it's replacing, and yet it's different. But familiarity through consent and familiarity through overexposure to a certain idea that may be untrue, but if it's repeated often enough, the familiarity just breeds this consent. And this phrase, Shakespeare's invention of the human, I've taken that from a Harold Bloom book, where he makes this, for some people, a hyperbolic, exaggerated claim that Shakespeare, to some extent, invented our current Western human subjectivity. Now, you may see that as a complete overstatement, but there's an element of truth that, as I'll be trying to show with little snippets from Hamlet, I can't think of a play that would be better than Hamlet to actually encapsulate what somebody else's interiority is like, or what subjective interiority, what goes on inside our heads, what we feel, what we think. The whole play is such a complex, both structurally, as I'll show you towards the end. Shakespeare uses the structure of the play to mimic some of the things that the most contemporary neuroscientists are talking about. It's the structure and also the content, and they work in perfect unison. So I'm opposing now, this is an interview that Keir Starmer did, again, just while he was campaigning to become Prime Minister. And I'm giving you the contents of this interview, some excerpts, because I think it provides a direct opposing example to the complexity of Hamlet, who's constantly asking why, who's constantly questioning his own dreams, his own mental projections. If anything, Hamlet has been accused of overthinking. And I'm going to show you from these quotes, you definitely couldn't accuse Keir Starmer of doing that. But then so this is the journalist speaking, but then he can't really say if he's strictly an optimist or a pessimist. And no, doesn't know if he's an extrovert or introvert either. So Keir Starmer speaking, I've never really thought about it. I don't know what that tells you. Well, no, it tells me. He doesn't know what he dreamed last night or ever. I don't dream. Just hits the pillow at 11 and bang, is out till around 5. He doesn't have a favourite novel or poem. Wasn't scared of anything as a child. Nothing. No phobias. This is harder than I thought. I am who I am. I know what I am. Channeling Gloria Gaynor there, Sakia. He has said, rejecting comparisons with former leaders. To me, he adds, everyone asks whose name I have tattooed on me, and the answer is none of them. He has tattoos? No, I haven't. Maybe I should. You ask me questions I've never asked myself, he says of the last time we met, so they re-meet later on in the campaign. That may seem funny, but part of being Keir, he sometimes talks about himself in the third person, is just ploughing on, knowing what I'm doing, knowing where I've got to go, without allowing myself time to stop and have a discussion with myself. I've just got this thing about keeping going. I say, because on his face was a genuine expression of amusement when I asked him about his emotional inner life, that I'm guessing he never did therapy. No, he says, no. And then, no, again in a lower tone bordering on horror. Sorry, I should have said no. He's not saying this is the only way to live. It's just that I am self-aware enough not to go into the side alleys and have a chat with myself about these things. That's the opposite of self-aware, you muppet. To be self-aware, you do question. Maybe not as much as Hamlet, but at least you do go into side alleys and have a chat with yourself. So, to quickly move on, to bring this to Hamlet and everything that Keir Starmer isn't. If you're interested in pursuing some of these Hamlet, and not just Hamlet, there are the major tragedies in this book. But A.C. Bradley was a Victorian critic, literary writer, and I think some professional English academics, English literature academics, maybe sometimes look down a bit on A.C. Bradley. But I think A, he writes beautifully, as most Victorians did, and B, he takes a character led approach to Shakespeare's plays. So he does at least 2 chapters from memory on Hamlet, and his particular theory, I'll narrow it down. It's a very comprehensive account of Hamlet's psychology and motivations. But I think the most interesting aspect that Bradley brings out is the way in which Hamlet was motivated by a type of existential despair at the hypocrisy of his mother, and to a lesser extent the hypocrisy of the court. And I think this has really big significance to most people's disillusionment with politics, at least in the UK at the moment. It's because exactly what Keir Starmer said at the beginning of his premiership about doing things the right way, following the correct procedures, came directly after we'd had Boris Johnson, who he had to step down because he didn't follow process. He was a law unto himself. So people thought, oh, at last we're going to have a decent politician full of probity and moral good character. And yet, no, the hypocrisy continues. And this is the increasing attitude in the UK. I don't think I'm saying anything out of line, is that a pox on all their houses, the idea that they're all as bad as each other, which is a perennial complaint about politicians. But I do think it's reached an extra height of feeling at the moment. So the hypocrisy, I like these 2 examples. The first one, Act 3, Scene 1. So Polonius, who's a very odd character, I'd love to talk about it at a future date in more detail, but we're off to blame in this. 'Tis too much proved that with devotion's visage and pious action we do sugar o'er the devil himself. So the way people act at court and the way they show religious good behaviour, religious devotion, when actually it's all for show. And similarly, Hamlet says later on about the way in which the court works. One may smile and be a villain. So that's the Keir Starmer scandal. That's some of its links to Hamlet. And now this concept of process I want to link with the concept of the philosophy of mind. And these are 2 books. The one on the right, Thomas Metzinger's Being No One, and to link it with Hamlet, the idea to be or not to be, that whole soliloquy. It's fascinating to think of it in terms of Metzinger's book. The one on the right, I'm trying to remember, it's 692. It's getting on for almost 700 pages from memory. It's his serious academic book. And the one on the left, I wouldn't say dumbed down, that's a bit insulting, but the book The Ego Tunnel is a much more popularised, much shorter version for a much wider market. But if you're interested in philosophy of mind issues, it gets a reputation for being very difficult. But I actually think Being No One is really worth, if you can get hold of, there are online copies, I can't tell you where, but you should be able to find, hopefully, a copy. But I've read the book, and we'll get into why I profoundly disagree with him on quite a few issues. But I quite like writers who, even if I think they're wrong for what it's worth, the effort to think of why they're wrong is really productive. It makes you think of so many other things, even if only to try in your own mind to disprove them. So, like I say, the ego tunnel is much more widely available. I think it's a basic book, so I think it's a cheap paperback, relatively cheap. Which again, if you're interested in these ideas or to see whether it's worth trying to hunt out a copy of Being No One, I thoroughly advise you to have a look at it. So I gave you this quote earlier because I think it relates directly to some of Metzinger's concerns. When Hamlet says, "Oh God, I could be bound in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." And remember, that could be I've had dreams. I don't know, I just think I've had dreams sounds slightly more poignant and ambiguous. But anyway. So I don't know, all these phobias people get accused of. I think I might be walnut phobic because I find the closeness of the walnut to the human brain quite disturbing in a way that shouldn't really bother me as much as it does. It's just incredible. Now this is from, I just wanted to quickly show you, I want to move into this area of trying to understand subjectivity from a scientific perspective. And when I started developing this talk, I was thinking of denial not being a river in Africa and the whole notion of defense mechanisms. And I came across this paper. I'll give you the full title. It's not important, but just to give you full context. It's multi-authored, as scientific papers tend to be. So Northoff, Bernpohl, Schoeneich, and Boker. And the title of the thing is, How Does Our Brain Constitute Defense Mechanisms? First-Person Neuroscience and Psychoanalysis, Psychotherapy, and Psychomatics. Oh, sorry, I think it must be, How Does Our Brain Constitute Defense Mechanisms? I've done this badly because I can't remember the actual name of the journal. Right, that's right. I'm an idiot. So this is as far as I can work out. The title of the paper is irony of ironies. I'm trying to talk about a neuroscience paper, and it's complex, detailed theoretical insights, and I can't even distinguish between the title and the journal. It's the way I've put it in my notes. It doesn't make it clear. But the actual title is, apologies if I've got this wrong, the title is How Does Our Brain Constitute Defense Mechanisms? First-Person Neuroscience and Psychoanalysis. And the name of the journal, I think, is Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics. And they just run on, so I was struggling to differentiate them. So while I was witching on about that, you've just probably read the whole panel here. But I like the idea on the left, mature, cognitively oriented mechanisms of defense. And on the right, we have immature, emotionally driven mechanisms of defense. So what they're saying is these are, in psychoanalytical terms, these are some of the categories. And there's another, the box goes on, I'll show you in a second. So these are the various, it's a schema of the types of things you do as a defense mechanism. And I've just put in a box for you, denial, which I would suggest is the key thing. In the Starmer scandal, dealing with emotional stresses by failing to recognise obvious implications, the appointment of the friend of Jeffrey Epstein, or consequences of a thought, act, or situation. The friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Not complex politics, just don't do it. So the whole of the scandal seems to me denial based on it. You can see from the previous slide, it's on the immature side of the defense mechanism schema. But if you look at all these different categories. So, for example, with reference to Hamlet, above the denial, 3 above, psychotic projection, hallucinatory and paranoid externalization of inaccessible thoughts and their connected effects. So Hamlet's not sure that the appearance of the ghost is real. And hence, he sets up the play within a play specifically to find out whether the ghost is telling the truth. So these are the schemas, and then the point they make in this scientific article is that these are all the way in which analysts try and make sense of subjectivity and people who are using defense mechanisms. So, for example, below denial, catatonia is one of the more extreme. Catatonia and autism are ways of just shutting down. So they're obviously defense mechanisms taken to the nth degree. But Hamlet as a whole covers a huge range of all these different psychoanalytical concepts. After all that wittering, why didn't I just wait for this slide and you can see what I was belatedly worked out? So that's the full article, finally, in all its titular glory. So they say one of the main methodological challenges in investigating the neuronal processes underlying defense mechanisms is to link first and third person data. And this is, I'll finish and then I'll make my comment. Being based upon subjective experience, psychoanalysis relies on first person data. This contrasts with neuroscience, which requires third person observation of neuronal states. Due to the neglect of subjective first person experience, neuronal states as third person data can be quantified and objectified. This, in contrast, remains impossible in the case of first person data, which are rather qualitative and subjective. I don't want to say rather. First person data, by its very nature, has to be qualitative and subjective. But what I was going to say was, before I interrupted myself, I find it interesting that highly intelligent scientists and philosophers can argue in a brilliant way. And if you're not careful, you risk, and in politics as well, you risk being sucked up in the beauty and complexity of the argument. But if you notice very early on and you pay most of your attention to their founding assumptions, you can save yourself a load of grief, because the first assumption that they'd want to try and find a way of linking first and third person data, they use quite a vague phrase, to link. And what I think you'll find out as the article went along was they're actually trying to reduce first person data to the level of third person data, because that's what science does best. So they're not just linking. I'd argue they actually are engaged in a reductive process, to go back to this concept of process. And that's their foundational error from a humanist normative point of view. So everything they do after this point, I think, is suspect because of their founding assumption. So if, however, the neuronal processes of defense mechanisms are to be investigated, subjective experience and neuronal states, i.e. first and third person data, have to be linked together to each other in a systematic way. So if, however, the neuronal processes of defense mechanisms are to be investigated, well, if they're to be investigated in the way you've assumed they need to be investigated, this is my point about foundational assumptions, then subjective experience and neuronal states have to be linked to each other in a systematic way, and this is where the process begins to take over. For this purpose, we created an appropriate methodological strategy, first-person neuroscience, which aims at systematically linking first and third-person data, which is what they keep banging on about, but I personally would say is a fool's errand. You're trying to combine, link as they call it, two mutually incompatible categories. So this is what, with the beautiful diagram, they're suggesting they're trying to do. So we have a helpfully image of an experiencing person with a brain as well, and a face. So psychoanalysis looks at the individual. First-person neuroscience, commonly practiced neuroscience looks at the actual brain, and their great invention, first-person neuroscience, is going to link the two. And this is from a different paper, but actually shows you. The one on the left is looking at from the inside of the brain, if you're right in the middle of the brain, looking to one side. So the lateral prefrontal cortex is the outside. And the point is, these things interact in incredibly complex ways. I had a lot of fun reading this paper. Well, these papers. In a different life, I stopped doing science at a very young age, but I actually found it much more interesting than I thought I would. So you have the DACC, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and then you've got the pre-SMA, the pre-supplementary motor area. As I don't know why I'm telling you this, you obviously knew all this ahead of time. And don't worry if you don't follow it, but this is just to give you a sense of what these type of neuroscientists are trying to do. So the DACC retains past cue information indicating costs and benefits associated with behavioural options over an extended period of time, an episode. When a cue initiates a high-stakes episode, the DACC provides sustained input to mid-lateral PFC, or mid-PFC, which represents cognitive demands stemming from past cues and imposes enduring, episodic, top-down biases on the selection of behaviour via its input to the posterior lateral PFC, post-PFC. So do you see how this is putting into process terms human thought, or what they can measure as a representation of human thought? It's not the felt experience of thinking. The latter employs concurrent contextual cue information to transiently guide the selection of stimulus-response associations in premotor cortices. The posterior lateral PFC is also energized by the pre-SMA, which evaluates costs and benefits stemming from current contextual cues. As a consequence of this motivated cascade of cognitive control, activity in the posterior lateral PFC, and thus the contextually driven selection of behavior, is modulated by past and current motivational and cognitive cues. So it's a very process-dominated way of describing. I was going to say what Proust might say in his, thousands of pages of literary writing. But to be serious for a second, In Search of Lost Time is basically a literary paean to this notion of what's being described here, except as a felt experience of a narrator's voice rather than this modelling, this processing. And I loved this. This was a quote from the article. So this is, when you get hungry enough, you find yourself speaking Spanish pretty well. This quote, attributed to African-American baseball legend Josh Gibson when temporarily plying his trade in 1930s Cuba, vividly captures the notion that motivation is important for cognition. So I just love the idea that and everything that came with it can be summarized so eloquently and succinctly by Josh Gibson. And I totally emphasize hunger motivates most of my life's actions, if I'm honest. So now we get on to Metzinger, being no one, which again is the complete opposite of to be or not to be, and Hamlet's concern with what it is to be a human being. So this is the very beginning of the book. This is a book about consciousness, the phenomenal self, and the first-person perspective. Its main thesis is that no such things as selves exist in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self. So Hamlet could have saved himself a lot of angst. All that ever existed were conscious self-models that could not be recognized as models. The phenomenal self is not a thing, but a process. So I've emphasized that and emboldened it because of the theme I'm pursuing about process. And the subjective experience of being someone emerges if a conscious information processing system operates under a transparent self-model. You are such a system right now as you read these sentences. Nice to know. Because you cannot recognize your self-model as a model, it is transparent. You look right through it. You don't see it, but you see with it. In other words, in other more metaphorical words, the central claim of this book is that as you read these lines, you constantly confuse yourself with the content of the self-model currently activated by your brain. So I'll try and explain as we go along, but this is basically the idea that we're not aware consciously of the model that is our brain that has content. And there's, as I mentioned earlier, there are all these recursive layers of processing going on. And we have our notion of our sense of self is assimilated. It's, as we'll see shortly, he describes it in the form of shadows. It's shading, it's not actual substance. I'm trying to remember, this is Laurence Olivier, the famous English actor. I'm thinking, I'll say British actor, offend anyone. 1948, I think this was, the film version of Hamlet. I just like the juxtaposition, obviously, of Yorick's head. The difference between inanimate matter and the human brain is made, couldn't be made more explicit. So this is what Metzinger does with the idea of Plato's cave, the shadows on the wall. It's important to note that a shadow, although dependent on, controlled by, and in a certain very weak sense representing the object that casts it, is never a distinct entity. Shadows as such don't exist. What exists are shaded surfaces. However, it is of course possible to confuse object and shaded surface, thereby treating the latter as a distinct entity. I claim that the conscious self is not a thing, but a shaded surface. It's not an individual object, but a process, the ongoing process of shading. Remember the quote I gave you earlier from Hamlet about with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the shadows of shadows. I think that Hamlet quote, in the light of this, written more than 400 years later, I'd strongly argue shows how psychologically complex Shakespeare was. So I've shown you this several times on the channel, but this is the representation of Plato's cave. So in the Plato's Republic, the idea is they're the prisoners, all they can see are shadows, and they mistake them for a real world outside that if they could escape, they could see for themselves. There's the further nuance that if you actually did escape, as the man in the fetching loincloth on the right, the sun would be too bright, you'd probably blind yourself. But Metzinger says we must imagine Plato's cave differently if we are to understand the neurophenomenological caveman's true situation. So that's what he refers to. Human beings are neurophenomenological cavemen and women. We're trapped within the cave of our own minds. There isn't any escape. There are low-dimensional phenomenal shadows of external perceptual objects dancing on the neural user surface of the caveman's brain. So much is true. There certainly is a phenomenal self-shadow as well. But what is this shadow the low-dimensional projection of? I claim that it is a shadow not of a captive person, but of the cave as a whole. It is the physical organism as a whole, including all of its brain, its cognitive activity, and its social relationships that is projecting inward from all directions at the same time, as it were. There is no true subject and no homunculus in the cave that could confuse itself with anything. It is the cave as a whole which episodically, during phases of waking and dreaming, projects a shadow of itself onto one of its many internal walls. The cave shadow is there. The cave itself is empty. So, as a neuro-phenomenological caveman, the idea is the lights are on but there's no one in. The fire's on but there's no one in. Now, I might try and discuss this with you in the comments for the hardcore people who are into this, but this is a brilliant book. And she also did an academic article that is so concise and beautifully written, where she takes issue with Metzinger's argument in a brilliant way. And before anyone gets excited, it's not naturism. I think that's a completely different. Various crude jokes came to me then for a second, which I will quickly pass over. But not naturism, naturalism, the idea that everything can be measured. When I was telling you about that paper about trying to measure first-person experience through third-person data, that's naturalism, the idea that everything can be reduced to the scientific model. And in this book, she does a brilliant, and in the article I mentioned, which would be lovely to talk about in detail if there's any interest, which is what I'll try and discuss in the comments. But she presents the humanist perspective back as a response to Metzinger in a stunning way. It's a brilliant book. That's not her, by the way, I don't think. I couldn't find if anyone knows what that image looks like a painting to me, but I didn't spend a lot of time looking, but I couldn't find who did that painting. She's describing what his argument is, what this self-model is. So this isn't really her own point of view. This is what she's saying about Metzinger. Some properties of a self-model are transparent. That is, we don't see them, we look through them. They are not introspectively accessible. Other properties are opaque. That is, we are aware of them. They are introspectively accessible. For example, as G.E. Moore pointed out, when we try to introspect, in other words, think in our own minds about the sensation of blue, the sensation, what the sensation of blue has in common with the sensation of green, is transparent. We look through it and see nothing but the blue. But the blue is opaque. It is what we see. So there are some points of agreement between Baker and Metzinger. And at this point, he's just describing the various ideas that we can have and how you can categorize them. And this is an interesting one. The idea that we have opaque thoughts that we are aware of, but according to Metzinger, we also have transparent thoughts that we're not aware that we're having. So the idea with the colour example is a nice one, because you don't really, it's what the transparency refers to, you don't normally have a sense of seeing what it's like to see colour. What you see are colours. And the colours are opaque, which allow you to see their colour. But we don't really see ourselves seeing, if that makes sense. The act of seeing is of its very nature transparent until there's something to be seen, like a colour, which is then opaque. So I think the way what I've just said, Metzinger says in a different way. A transparent representation is characterized by the fact that the only properties accessible to introspective attention are their content properties, which I think is what I just said in a different way. Just to add some image, Hamlet, Horatio in the Graveyard, Eugène Ferdinand Victor Delacroix from 1839. So again, this is Baker summarising Metzinger. Our subjective experience in the first instance is activation of representations in transparent models, i.e. only the representational contents are experienced, not the models themselves. In other words, subjective experience is phenomenal experience. It consists of activation of models of representations. We cannot experience the models. We experience only the content properties of representations, whether the contents depict anything outside the model or not. So wait, I'll go back very quickly. I don't want to spend ages on this. But if you can remember, this is how Metzinger presents. And it would be, I actually really would like to go into this in more depth, do it full justice. But just as this is a summary of what he's about, and then I wanted to show you the type of people who offer a completely different notion of process. So the book on the right, it's a bit like the previous Metzinger. The book on the right is the really difficult one, Process and Reality. But Whitehead gives a much different, much more humanistic interpretation of process that you could set against Keir Starmer and Metzinger. And again, maybe in future, I might try and engage with it, but it's a difficult book. The modes of thought on the left is much more accessible. So I'll just give you some quick ideas from it. So one characterization of importance is that aspect of feeling whereby a perspective is imposed upon the universe of things felt. So a perspective is imposed upon the universe of things felt. Perspective is the dead abstraction of mere fact from the living importance of things felt. So this is directly opposite to Metzinger's ideas. The concrete truth is the variation of interest. So it's the human element. The abstraction is the universe in perspective. The consequent science is the scheme of physical laws, which, with unexpressed presuppositions, I was talking about this earlier, about the unexpressed presuppositions of trying to turn first person into third person data, expresses the patterns of perspective as observed by average human beings. So this is Whitehead critiquing the scientific mentality. Science can find no individual enjoyment in nature, which reminded me of I'm trying to remember it, the Hamlet quote, is that I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth. I think that's Act 2, Scene 2. But science can find no individual enjoyment in nature. Science can find no aim in nature. Science can find no creativity in nature. It finds mere rules of succession, which I think you can see in the schema about methods of denial, or the big list I gave you of all the different defense mechanisms. These are mere rules of succession. It's trying to schematize. Science only deals with half the evidence provided by human experience. The disastrous separation of body and mind, which has been fixed on European thought by Descartes, is responsible for this blindness of science. Two things there. One is, I think he's being a bit mean on Descartes. There is a school of thought that Descartes has been, by some people, misrepresented and misunderstood. But Whitehead's right to say that his reputation is of this separation of body and mind is responsible for this blindness of science. I might have mentioned this before, but there is a Thomas Dolby pop song where at the time he was a very famous UK scientist, Magnus Pike, actually he exclaims during the song, "She blinded me with science," and that runs through the Thomas Dolby song. So anyway, slight irrelevant tangent there. The essence of great experience is penetration into the unknown, the unexperienced. If you like to phrase it so, philosophy is mystical. For mysticism is direct insight into depths as yet unspoken. But the purpose of philosophy is to rationalize mysticism, not by explaining it away like Metzinger and the others do, but by the introduction of novel verbal characterizations, rationally coordinated. And I'm showing you this because I think this describes what Hamlet's all about. So please remember for the end of this talk, this phrase, for mysticism is direct insight into depths as yet unspoken. So that really does relate to one of the final quotes I'm going to use from Hamlet. Two aspects, the depths, looking into the abyss, which I think Hamlet does all the way through the play, but as yet unspoken. This notion of what remains unspoken, I think, is crucial. Ironically, for a play like Hamlet, where all he does is speak, I'm going to argue at the very end of this talk, just a plot spoiler, that I think it's what's unspoken is what the whole play is really about. And these are just more examples of how you can think of how much more humanist certain philosophers are. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space. Remember that infinite space of being bound by a nut? All mean egotism vanishes. I have become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, but nothing here is not the same as Metzinger. I see all the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. And Whitehead again. Faith in reason is the trust that, at the base of things, we shall not find mere arbitrary mystery. This faith springs from direct inspection of the nature of things, as disclosed in our own immediate present experience. To experience this faith is to know that in being ourselves, we are more than ourselves, to know that our experience, dim and fragmentary as it is, yet sounds the utmost depths of reality. Again, what Hamlet does as a play. To know that, while the harmony of logic lies upon the universe as an iron necessity, the aesthetic harmony stands before it as a living ideal, moulding the general flux in its broken progress towards finer, subtler issues. Again, the utmost depths of reality. I think that's the Hamlet. And finally, to get away from Whitehead, but to link this up to the concept of process, now as a first approximation, the notion of life implies a certain absoluteness of self-enjoyment. This must mean a certain immediate individuality, which is a complex process of appropriating into a unity of existence the data presented as relevant by the physical processes of nature. Life implies the absolute, individual, self-enjoyment arising out of this process of appropriation. So I've highlighted and emboldened the various mentions of process or processes. It's just to show you that there are, to use his title, modes of thought that Whitehead embodies, in which process is a life-affirming rather than a life-denying. Remember the name of Metzinger's book, No One, Being No One. Whereas Ralph Waldo Emerson and Whitehead, they have a much more humanistic, we may merge into the world life force, but there's a very strong focus upon the individual nature. This notion of self-enjoyment, a certain absoluteness of self-enjoyment. This must mean a certain immediate individuality. So just because there are complex neuro-phenomenological processes going on doesn't mean we're cavemen. It's all about this certain immediate individuality for Whitehead. So to start summing up, there is this phrase supervenience, which I'll define in a second. And I think I've implicitly all the way through accused Metzinger of reductionism. In other words, reducing the unique qualities of subjective experience and to try and make them third person data points in a scientific model. That's all the examples I've given you from the scientific neuroscience papers and Metzinger's work. So the definition of supervenience is property set A supervenes on property set B if two objects cannot differ in A without also differing in B. So all the way through Metzinger's work, this would be one of my criticisms of him. he notices correlations or supervenience between neuronal processes and what the brain might be doing, which he then equates with individual thought. And I would suggest this all goes to the notion of necessary but not sufficient conditions. I would argue, and I think Baker argues, necessary but not sufficient is what goes on. Yes, you need all these complex neuronal processes, but that's not sufficient to describe individuality the way Whitehead and others describe it. So, to give you a specific example, Metzinger uses the old brain in a vat at one point and argues that there's no reason why the brain in the vat couldn't have a phenomenological experience very similar to we feel like when we're being looked at. And it's too long to get into, but just because some of the neuronal processes are taking place that would be the same in a normal, healthy, non-vat brain, someone walking around in the real world, I think there are strong arguments that Baker makes that these two things aren't comparable the way that Metzinger would like to reduce them to. So this would be the definition of non-reductionist dependence, which I'd be on the side of and Baker is on the side of. While A depends on B, it does not mean A can be completely reduced to B. For example, beauty, the aesthetic, supervenes on paint, arrangement, the physical, but you cannot fully define beauty only with chemistry. Another quick example would be, I think I came across the notion that if you know anything about chess, Spassky and Fischer played in the 70s? Some beautiful games. Kasparov played some beautiful games. All these great chess players. And it's like looking at the game of chess, its inherent logical beauty. And instead of that, you talk about how the pieces are moved, the speed at which the pieces are moved, the wood from which the pieces are made. It's a complete focus on the wrong thing. It's this confusion of categories. So the non-reductionist dependence recognizes there is a difference. There's something else. Beauty, aesthetics supervenes on paint, but you cannot fully define beauty only with chemistry. So to give you a specific example, I've used this example before, but I think it fits beautifully. Paul Tillich, famous theologian, he'd fought in the First World War, and then afterwards he went to see a famous painting. So going to Berlin, I hurried to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. There on the wall was a picture that had me comforted in battle. That had comforted me in battle. Madonna with singing angels, painted by Sandro Botticelli in the 15th century. Gazing up at it, I felt a state approaching ecstasy. In the beauty of the painting, there was beauty itself. It shone through the colours of the paint as the light of day shines through the stained glass windows of a medieval church. As I stood there, bathed in the beauty its painter had envisioned so long ago, some of the divine source of all things came through to me. I turned away shaken. That moment has affected my whole life, giving me the keys for the interpretation of human existence, brought vital joy and spiritual truth. So the bit I've emboldened there and emphasised is the light of day shines through the stained glass windows of a medieval church. Very similar materials contained in Proust's Combray section of La Recherche de Pompidou that we're looking at in the reading group. That's the painting he's talking about, Mary with the Child and Singing Angels, from Botticelli, circa 1478. But this is all to go to this is the substance of aesthetics. This isn't the process. I compare it with what is usually called revelation, the language of religion. I know that no artistic experience can match the moments in which prophets were grasped in the power of the divine presence. But I believe there is an analogy between revelation and what I felt. In both cases, the experience goes beyond the way we encounter reality in our daily lives. It opens up depths experienced in no other way. I now know that the picture is not the greatest. I have seen greater since then. But that moment of ecstasy has never been repeated. And this all goes to the concept of subjectivity. It goes to the concept of art, what it can bring out in us. And I fail to see how the scientific models I was showing you earlier can deal adequately with the way in which Tillich is describing the subjective experience of art. And to give you a specific example, this is the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. These are some of the original stained glass windows. These are later. These are from 1864. This is the Chapel of Saint Clotilde by, and there was a guy called Viollet-le-Duc who, in 1864, there needed to be a renovation because of what happened during the French Revolution. And these were the renovations in the 1860s. So stunningly beautiful and renovated within keeping of the environment of Notre Dame. There's a big controversy in France at the moment. President Macron has commissioned these to go in. These will go into Notre Dame unless the French people with taste manage to stop him. I think it's Claire Tabouret is the artist who created these. And I'm sorry, I just cannot accept these are worth going in the cathedral. But I'm sure all due selection processes have been followed for these to be deemed worthy. So I'll finish up now with, I like this quote from Adorno and Horkheimer, who I will return to when I'm talking about the Odyssey and future. But I think they identify a really important thing here. Humans believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. This has determined the path of demythologization, of enlightenment, which equates the living with the non-living, as myth had equated the non-living with the living. So he's basically saying this need to demythologize, to make everything fit a scientific schema, which I've been showing you from the start of this talk. It's part of this human tendency. Humans believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. Enlightenment, which led to modern science, is mythical fear radicalized. The pure immanence of positivism. In other words, positivism becomes everywhere, even when you're trying to think of the human brain. The neuroscience third-party data model takes over the subjective thought model. Its ultimate product is nothing other than a form of universal taboo. Nothing is allowed to remain outside, since the mere idea of the outside is the real source of fear. Remember the very early definition of a psychodrama. It's this cathartic working through. Well, Hamlet works through this fear of the outside. Whereas I think Adorno and Horkheimer point out beautifully that the scientific enlightenment is constantly striving to exorcise the fear rather than cathartically deal with it. So this is Nietzsche talking about the birth of tragedy, and I'm going to link this to Hamlet and then finish. For the rapture of the Dionysian state with its annihilation of the ordinary bounds and the limits of existence contains, while it lasts, a lethargic element in which all personal experiences of the past become immersed. This chasm of oblivion separates the worlds of everyday reality and of Dionysian reality. But as soon as this everyday reality re-enters consciousness, it is experienced as such, with nausea. An ascetic, will-negating mood is the fruit of these states. And interestingly, Sartre wrote a novel, La Nausée, Nausea, because the main character, Roquentin, has this nauseous reaction when he feels reality in its fullness. In this sense, the Dionysian man resembles Hamlet. Both have once looked truly into the essence of things. They have gained knowledge, and nausea inhibits action, for their action would not change anything in the eternal nature of things. They feel it to be ridiculous or humiliating that they should be asked to set right a world that is out of joint, which is a direct allusion to the world is out of joint quote. Knowledge kills action. Action requires the veils of illusion, or the denial of Keir Starmer and the scandal I opened this talk with. That is the doctrine of Hamlet, not that cheap wisdom of Jack the Dreamer who reflects too much and, as it were, from an excess of possibilities, does not get round to action. Not reflection, no, true knowledge, an insight into the horrible truth, outweighs any motive for action, both in Hamlet and in the Dionysian man. So that's the depths. You remember I asked you to think earlier, or I emphasised the concept of the depths. That's what Hamlet does. He looks into the abyss. He sees the depths of the hypocrisy of the court. And that's what I think people are suffering from today with politics, especially in the UK. It's the depths of the hypocrisy just fills you with some type of, without sounding overly melodramatic, it's a nauseous feeling. You've just had enough of it all. And it leads to inaction rather than action. Hamlet's a particularly extreme case of it. So that's the depths. And then just to finish to show you how sophisticated Hamlet was, this is Metzinger talking about and don't worry about if you follow it, I'm just trying to convey the complexity in his own model. I mentioned earlier the recursive levels that just keep turning on themselves. A self-model is a model of the very representational system that is currently activating it within itself. The content of a phenomenal self-model, PSM, is the conscious self, your bodily sensations, your present emotional situation, plus all the contents of your phenomenally experienced cognitive processes. So it's all wrapped up. A self-model is a model of the very representational system that is currently activating it within itself. Remember back in the beginning of that quote, the shadows of the shadow, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern commenting with Hamlet. I just see the parallels. Shakespeare's engaging with what Metzinger thinks he's breaking new ground with. And to give you an example of how he does that, there are quartos and folios. There are these different editions. And in this particular article, Rory Lufnane, what doesn't happen in Hamlet, he's describing how the different editions of Hamlet contain different items, there were changes in the text. So you never quite know which version you're getting or which was the original, because they evolve and there's different versions competing with each other. So there are plays within play to that extent. Then the Mousetrap, the murder of Gonzalo in the play, is preceded by a dumb show. So I mentioned earlier, there's a play, the dumb show, within the play, the Mousetrap, which is a play within the play, Hamlet. And Hamlet is a play about the play of life. So there are all those recursive levels. So we have versions of the play that is Hamlet, and each of those versions includes its own skewed, partial versions of the backstory producing Hamlet, via first the dumb show, and second the play within the play. Hamlet in this sense is endlessly recursive, a representation of a representation, a reflection of a reflection ad infinitum. Or rather, Hamlet in its three early texts offers us a set of representations of a representation, reflections of a reflection. Perhaps we should not reflect upon this for too long, or it may become tedious. I hope not. So, summing up, philosophy is an attempt to express the infinity of the universe in terms of the limitations of language. It's Alfred North Whitehead from his autobiographical notes. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Again, this is what I see in Hamlet, these philosophical ideas. That tension between the inanimate dead skull, the quintessence of dust, and the actor's or Hamlet's own cognitive processes. And this is what I wanted to end on, because I just think this is one of the most underrated quotes in the whole play. So Hamlet says, so tell him with the occurrence, in other words, the events, more and less, which have solicited. So basically tell him what's gone on. The rest is silence. It's that bit, the rest is silence. Because for all his wordiness, for all the things he tries to say, for all the things he thinks, there's a huge gap, the things that can't be said, the things that can't be fully understood, the things that can't be captured in a scientific schema. The rest is silence. Until the next time, all the very best. Take care.